While we were partying, my side guy appeared behind me and grabbed my asterisk SS. Husband saw it and did this. Hey Reddit, posting on here because I always see the TikTok videos with the Minecraft backgrounds. I've heard that this subreddit can be a place to get some really good advice. Hence why I'm doing this. I've never really used Reddit before this, but I have heard of it. My name is Miriam, and I am a 33-year-old woman. My husband's name is Neil, and he is 32. Neil and I have been married for about 2 years. We have 2 kids, the eldest is 6 years old and the youngest is 4. He recently found out that I had been cheating on him, and now wants a divorce, which I think is absurd because it was just a mistake. I feel like he needs to forgive me, and I also need some way to win back his trust, so I would really appreciate any advice. Neil and I met in college. He thinks it was true love and a coincidence that we met, but it was not. I had already heard about Neil, and I knew that he came from a very wealthy family. I didn't want to suffer, and by the time I was in college, I already knew that I would not do well as a worker, and that I definitely wasn't made to suffer. I didn't want to struggle like other people and spend countless hours a week trying to climb the corporate ladder, just so I could be paid some major money as salary. I also wasn't really the best at school, so there was also that too. Neil was my new ticket. Neil and I started dating, and we've been together ever since. He was the perfect package, which I wanted. He was handsome while he was also from a wealthy family, which meant that my needs were taken care of. Neil's family did not like me, and they tried their best to dissuade Neil from dating me. They even went as far as making me sign a prenup when we got married and doing things like putting whatever property they bought for us under Neil's name, just to frustrate me and make me angry. But I never really cared because it didn't matter whether it was under my name or Neil's. I would still have access to it, and I wasn't planning on leaving Neil at all. Shortly after we graduated, before we even got married, I refused to go for my master's or even get a job. I told Neil I wanted to become a stay-at-home wife, and then when we had our kids, I was then a stay-at-home mom. I didn't want to work, so even when Neil again suggested getting me a job at his parents' company, I immediately refused. I just wanted to be able to stay home and do whatever I wanted. Neil took care of all the bills and expenses, and I took care of the home. It was a very simple arrangement that worked for us. Neil's family's disapproval never bothered me much. Their attempts to make me feel unwelcome only made my determination to stay by Neil's side stronger. Despite the prenup and the property titles, I knew I was secure. Neil loved me, and that was all that mattered. Our life together was comfortable. Neil's career was flourishing, and I enjoyed being able to just stay home and relax. Things were great, but I've got to admit, there was a part of our relationship that's been bugged me. Our intimacy, or lack thereof, was kind of a sore spot. It's not that Neil and I didn't have our moments. We did, but they were too few and far between. His crazy schedule kept us apart more than I liked, and when we did have time together, it was rushed, and it lacked that spark we used to have. I understood. Neil's was busy providing for us, and I was grateful for that. But it also left our bedroom life feeling a bit routine and predictable. I missed the passionate, spontaneous moments we used to share. Yeah, of course I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I kept those feelings to myself. I put on a happy face for the sake of our seemingly perfect life. But deep down, I wanted more than just material comforts. I wanted the connection we had when he first fell in love with me. Sometimes I wondered if Neil felt the same way or if he was okay with how things were. I also wondered if maybe it was just the natural progression of a long-term relationship, but I still wanted something more. As things continued, I noticed that the gap in our intimacy only kept on growing. It wasn't as frequent or fulfilling as I wanted, partly because Neil was always busy with work. This started bothering me, so I decided to have a serious talk with him. I went to Neil and suggested that maybe we should open up our marriage. I thought it could inject some excitement and closeness back into our lives. But Neil shut down the idea immediately. He was adamant about keeping our marriage strictly monogamous, and he reminded me about our vows and commitment. His refusal hit me hard. I felt upset and frustrated because I genuinely believed it could help us. Neil's rigid stance made me feel like he didn't understand my needs or consider what might improve our relationship. It led to an argument between us, and I started to wonder if we could ever bridge this gap. Despite Neil saying no, I kept nudging him subtly. I didn't want our marriage to feel completely empty, even though I married Neil for his financial stability. But wanting some intimacy didn't mean I was ready to throw everything away. No matter how much I hinted or got upset, Neil stood firm. He bluntly pointed out that if I couldn't find happiness in our marriage, maybe it was time to consider divorce. The mere thought of divorce shook me to the core. Neil wasn't just my husband. He was my rock, my stability. Losing that was unimaginable, even if it meant suppressing my desires. So I backed off from pushing for change and tried to distract myself. I hit the gym more often and started finding solace in workouts and the routine of our daily life, since the kids were old enough for school and we had help at home. Gym was my way of coping, even though deep down, I knew something was still missing in our relationship. During that time, since I was now spending more time at the gym, I crossed paths with Simon. He was another regular at the gym, and it didn't take long to notice that he had taken an interest in me. Simon wasn't subtle about it at all. He'd often give me flirty glances, toss playful comments my way, and go out of his way to assist me with equipment or exercises. His smile would light up whenever I caught him looking my way. At first, I tried to brush off his advances and keep my distance. After all, I was married, and despite the issues with Neil, I didn't want to complicate things further. But loneliness has a way of wearing down resistance. Simon's persistent attempts to befriend me and his charming behavior slowly broke down my walls. He'd suggest we work out together, propose coffee outings, and generally make efforts to get closer to me. As time went on, I couldn't dodge Simon anymore. His persistence and charm had chipped away at my defenses. I figured it wouldn't hurt to be pals with him since Neil never laid down any rules about hanging out with guys. So I started chatting with Simon more, accepting his help, flirting back, and exchanging smiles. We hit it off, exchanging numbers, and soon we were talking regularly, just enjoying each other's company and chatting about all sorts of stuff. Even though I felt a twinge of guilt, it was nice to have someone else to talk to, and a bit of excitement outside my usual routine with Neil. As Simon and I grew closer, I found a newfound happiness. We were always chatting, and I often found myself glued to my phone, eagerly awaiting his messages. I became quite protective of my phone, changing passwords and being cautious about leaving it unattended. Although Neil never directly confronted me about it, I could tell he noticed something was up. He would give me curious looks whenever he caught me laughing or smiling at my phone, almost as if he sensed there was more to my interactions than I was letting on. As I grew closer to Simon, I found myself pulling away from Neil even more. The emptiness and longing I once felt were replaced by the joy and excitement I got from being with Simon. Our relationship went beyond just talking. We started spending a lot of time together outside our regular routines. We'd go out for movies, dinners, and other fun activities that I hadn't done in ages because it felt lonely doing them alone. Whenever the kids were at school and my daily chores were done, thanks to our helper, I would go out with Simon for a day out. We explored new places, shared meals, and had moments that brought back a spark in my life. Despite this, I was still cautious about taking things too far, so we stuck to public places. As I started hanging out more with Simon, Neil couldn't help but notice how often I was out and about. He gave me a curious look and asked what was up with my sudden social life. I played it cool, telling him that I was just enjoying myself, trying to have some fun after feeling so lonely for a while. Neil seemed to understand and even felt sorry for not realizing how isolated I had been. He promised to try and be around more, even talking about cutting back on work. Meanwhile, my time with Simon evolved. We began spending time at his place watching movies, playing games, and just chilling together. Simon didn't know I was married. He thought I was just a private person. Things between Simon and me started heating up fast. We went from hanging out innocently to having sex quite quickly. Even though he asked me out several times, I avoided committing to a serious relationship at first. I liked what we had, but I wasn't ready to leave my marriage or make a commitment. However, Simon grew tired of the uncertainty. He gave me an ultimatum, saying he wanted more than just casual encounters. He wanted a real relationship with me. I was hesitant, knowing the complications of my situation, but eventually I agreed to take things further with him. Deep down, I hoped I could manage the situation without it getting too complicated. I thought I could handle things and just dump Simon if he became too serious. Well, as my relationship with Simon continued, I became more cautious about what I shared with him. I strategically dodged his questions, especially those probing into my personal life. I didn't want him to know too much about me, fearing that he could use that information to manipulate or control me if things took a turn. I played it cool, telling him I didn't have social media when I did, and I carefully avoided any discussions about my family or personal background. It was all part of my plan to keep a distance and ensure that I had an escape route if I ever needed to step back from the relationship without any complications. Balancing my affair with Simon and my marriage to Neil was like walking a tightrope without a safety net. It took careful planning and quick thinking to keep everything under wraps. I got pretty good at toggling my phone's location settings and leaving it behind at home strategically. Neil wasn't the type to check my location often, which made things easier, but I couldn't let my guard down for a second. At first, sharing locations with Neil seemed like a sensible safety measure, in case we needed to find each other in an emergency. But over time, it became my cover-up, hiding my sneaky links with Simon. It's funny how things can twist like that. Despite my efforts to keep up appearances, guilt was always there, lurking in the background. Every time I silenced my phone or came up with a believable excuse, a pang of guilt hit me. I knew deep down that this secret wouldn't stay hidden forever. And yep, it finally came out. Neil's friend had invited us to a party he was throwing. We hadn't been to a party in a very long time as we were usually busy, but Neil suggested we go since it had been a while since we've gone out together. The nanny was with our kids, and Neil had made sure to finish work on time so we could attend the party together. It was a gesture that both surprised and pleased me. Neil's friend was someone we both cared about deeply, and I knew the event would be a great opportunity to catch up with our old friends and unwind. I did feel a little nagging feeling that I couldn't shake off. I felt like something wrong was going to happen, but I just decided that it was because it had been a while since Neil and I had gone to a social gathering like this. As the night progressed at the party, my husband and I were having a great time dancing together. The atmosphere was lively, the music was pumping, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits. We mingled with friends, shared laughs, and indulged in a few drinks. Then came the moment that turned everything upside down. As we were dancing, enjoying each other's company, I suddenly felt a sharp slap on my behind. It took me by surprise, and I turned around quickly to see who it was. To my shock and horror, it was Simon standing there with a mischievous grin on his face. I froze for a moment, feeling a mix of embarrassment, guilt, and panic. I glanced at my husband, hoping he hadn't noticed, but his expression told me otherwise. Neil's face darkened, his eyes had narrowed, and it was like he was trying to process what had just happened. I could see that he was angry, and I knew I was in deep trouble. In that instant, I regretted every decision that had led me to this point. My secret affair, the lies, the deceit, it all came crashing down in that single slap. The tension in the air felt suffocating as Simon just stood there, seemingly oblivious to what he had done. I was frozen. I was panicking and desperate to save myself, but I also wasn't thinking. Simon showing up at the party was a shocker. I never saw that coming, and if I had known, I would have avoided this mess altogether. But here we were, with Neil staring at me like he was waiting for an explanation, and I had to think on my feet. Simon started asking me all kinds of questions, and they were all hitting me like a ton of bricks. Who was Neil? Just a friend? Simon's directedness caught me off guard, and I was still struggling to find the right words. Well, I finally forced myself to calm down and decided I would throw Simon under the bus. In a split-second decision, I tried to downplay Simon's role. I was hoping to buy some time. So I turned to Neil and introduced Simon as my gym buddy, who I worked out with sometimes. I said Simon could be overly friendly sometimes. I shot pleading looks at Simon, silently urging him to play along, but he refused. He was visibly frustrated and angry as he corrected me, telling Neil that he was more than a friend. He was my boyfriend. Neil's jaw practically hit the floor. It was like a sin out of a movie. The room went quiet, everyone waiting for an explanation. But I had nothing. No excuse, no way to untangle the mess I'd created. I panicked. My mind had started racing again as I realized the enormity of what had just happened. In a moment of sheer panic, I bolted for the bedroom. I just didn't know what to do. I knew I was in trouble. Essentially, I was done for. If only I had known it would end like this, I would have cut things off with Simon ages ago. But now there was no going back. The bathroom felt like my only refuge, a small space where I could hide from the mess outside. Sitting on the toilet seat, I just prayed for some kind of miracle. I even shed a few tears. Everything I had worked for, all my efforts to secure financial stability, felt like they were crumbling because of Simon's careless and stupid reveal. Time kind of blurred together as I sat there. I was just lost in my thoughts and fears. When I finally came out, the party was winding down, and the few remaining guests were staring at me with silent judgment. Neil's friend shook his head in disapproval, and I couldn't blame him. I brushed past the lingering stares. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to salvage my relationship with Neil. By the time I stepped outside, both Neil and Simon had already left. I called for an Uber, desperate to get home and sort out the chaos. We got home, and when I tried to pay the driver, I realized our joint account was frozen. I tried to go inside the house, hoping that Neil would give me money, but when I got past the gate, I realized my things were thrown outside on the porch. I panicked, bit still. I knocked on the door, hoping against hope that someone would answer, but nobody did. Neil must have instructed the nanny not to let me in. Left with no other options, I turned to our neighbor, practically begging for some money to settle the Uber fare. Thankfully, she understood the urgency, and I hurried back to pay off the driver. Leaving my home felt like admitting defeat, but I had no other option. With a heavy heart, I packed up my essentials, called for another Uber, and headed to my parents' house. Their surprise at my sudden arrival was understandable, but they welcomed me nonetheless. After settling in, they sat me down for a serious talk. I poured out the whole story to them, holding nothing back. Their disappointment was evident, and they didn't mince words about it. They made it clear that they can't house me indefinitely, and I need to face my husband and sort things out. The thought of losing Neil and everything we had built together is terrifying. I know I need to find a way to mend our relationship, but I am at a loss for where to start. I need advice, guidance, anything that can help me navigate this mess and salvage what is left of my life. Update. Hey, Reddit. I've been getting a lot of heat since my last post, and I get it. I messed up big time. I know I cheated, and I'm not proud of it. But constantly reminding me of my mistakes isn't helping anyone. If you don't have anything constructive to say, please refrain from commenting. Now, on to addressing some of the common comments and questions. Many of you criticize me for being ungrateful and using my husband for his money. Let's clear this up. I do love my husband. Yes, financial stability was a factor in our relationship, but it's not the sole reason I stayed with him. Love is complicated, and our relationship has many layers beyond just money. I repeat, my initial attraction to Neil's wealth doesn't mean I never loved him. It's more complex than just financial stability. I genuinely care for him. Some of you also questioned how Simon never got suspicious. Trust me, he did. I kept him in the dark about important details like my social media presence and even my last name. He grew suspicious, but I brushed it off with excuses about being a private person. It was deceitful, and I regret it now. Also, to answer a question I have been getting frequently. No, I haven't spoken to Simon since the party incident. He sent angry messages, accusing me, and then blocked me. As for the update, things haven't improved much. My parents are getting impatient. My husband wants a divorce, blaming me entirely for the cheating. I tried to explain my loneliness, but he sees it as excuses. He's adamant about ending things and even mentioned custody of our kids. I'm at a loss. I don't want a divorce, but I don't know how to fix this mess. Is there any hope for salvaging my marriage? Any advice would be appreciated. Update. Hey Reddit, I'm back and the hate train seems to be running strong. It's amazing how some of you can be so sarcastic and ironic in your comments. Yes, I've been called a gold digger and maybe I am. Who wouldn't want a better life? But seriously, let's not pretend like anyone here wouldn't do the same if given the chance. We all want comfort and security. Now for an actual update, I don't have much to report. My situation hasn't improved. My parents are growing impatient with my stay, understandably so. They're talking about intervening with my husband, trying to convince him to take me back. Money-wise, I'm completely broke. Our joint account was drained and now I have nothing. My parents can't keep supporting me indefinitely. As for Neil, he's still set on a divorce. I've tried visiting the kids, hoping to mend things, but he's distant. Whenever I'm around, he makes it clear he doesn't want me there. It's heartbreaking. I keep pleading for another chance, but he's adamant. So that's where things stand. It's a tough time, and I'm not sure what the future holds. Keep the constructive advice coming if you have any. Thanks for reading, even amidst the criticism. Update. Hey Reddit, mini update here. Today has been wild, and I need to fill you in on the latest. So my parents and I decided to pay Neil a visit, hoping they could work some magic and convince him to reconsider. I've been trying to reach out to Neil's parents too, but it seems like they've blocked me. I bet they're thrilled that Neil finally kicked me out, and I'm sure he spilled the beans to them about everything. Anyway, back to today. We went to Neil's house, and surprisingly, he let us in. He was civil at first, but that didn't last long. My parents jumped in, pulling out all the stops to persuade him to forgive me. They even brought up religion and forgiveness, which was comical because none of us are particularly religious. Neil didn't hold back. He shut them down, pointing out the irony of preaching forgiveness when none of us were devout believers. He told my parents bluntly that they raised a cheater, and instead of trying to change his mind, they should reflect on their parenting. Ouch, that stung. Then Neil turned to me and started mocking me. He asked about Simon, knowing full well that Simon had cut ties with me. He said I got what I deserved for trying to manipulate everyone. He made it clear that I couldn't have my cake and eat it too. It was humiliating, to say the least. In the end, he kicked us out, leaving me feeling utterly embarrassed. I guess I have a lot to think about, especially about the consequences of my actions. Update. Hey Reddit, quick update from me. Today was rough. I got served with divorce papers and it hit me hard. I couldn't bring myself to see the kids as planned because I was just overwhelmed with sadness. I didn't want them to see me in that state. Neil has been talking to the kids and explaining things in a way they can understand. They're a bit confused, but Neil assured me he told them that I would be living in a different house, and they seem to think having two houses would be cool. It's bittersweet, but I'm glad they're coping as best as they can. I'm trying to process everything right now. It's a lot to take in, but I wanted to share this little update with you all. Update. Hey Reddit, it's been a minute since I last checked in. Honestly, I almost forgot this place existed, but I knew the hate train would still be chugging along when I returned. Not disappointed, Reddit. Not disappointed at all. So here's the final update you've all been waiting for. Neil and I are officially divorced. Let me give you the rundown. We went through the whole court process, which was surprisingly quick. You see, where I live, there's typically a 1-year separation period before divorce. But if you file based on infidelity, things move much faster. Neil took that route, citing my infidelity, and boom, court proceedings accelerated. The courtroom experience was brutal. My parents begrudgingly paid for a lawyer, and let's just say the odds weren't in my favor. Infidelity is a serious deal here, and it heavily influences custody decisions. Guess what? Neil got custody and I got weekend visitations. It stung, to say the least. As for assets, well, I barely got anything. A small amount of cash that's already dwindling, and now I'm left with debts to repay. No house, no major assets, just a reality check. Now, on to the job hunt. It's been tough given my resume gap and lack of work experience post-graduation. I snagged a job with an okay salary, but it's below average. Still, it's a start. Living with my parents has been a lifesaver, even though I thought they'd kick me out ages ago. They're letting me stay while I pay them minimal rent. Eventually, I'll move out and probably get a roommate because housing costs are insane here. I'm hopeful for the future, despite the setbacks. Maybe one day I'll land a better job and get back on my feet. It's a cliche, but I wanted to thank those of you who offered support and understanding amidst the hate. This might be my last post here, deleting after I settle into my new job. Thanks for reading, Reddit. It's been a ride.